My parents skipped my wedding for my sister's party after she punched me. Now my grandparents are giving me away instead. For as long as I can remember, it was obvious that my parents favored my older sister, Melanie, over me. She was the child they had planned for, while I was the unexpected surprise that arrived just 10 months later. I always had the feeling that they never really wanted me, but since the pregnancy happened, they went through with it anyway. My mother's parents had already passed away before I was born, but my dad's parents were still around, and they played a huge role in raising me. In many ways, Grandma and Grandpa became my real source of love and support, the kind I often felt was missing from my own parents. There were so many times when my parents would pack up and take Melanie on trips, leaving me behind with my grandparents. As a little kid, I didn't mind too much. Staying with Grandma and Grandpa was always fun. But as I got older, around 6 or 7, I started to realize just how unfair it was. And the issue wasn't just with my parents, it was with Melanie, too. I never really resented her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the extra piece in the family, the one who didn't quite belong. And the worst part? She knew it, and she made sure I felt that way every single day. Melanie turned everything into a competition: grades, attention from our parents, even the smallest achievements. It was like I was constantly fighting for validation, and no matter what I did, she always came out on top because our parents were always on her side. Over time, I started to feel small, like I could never measure up. We never saw eye to eye, and our relationship felt less like sisterhood and more like an endless contest, one I never seemed to win. One time, Melanie wanted to befriend a group of girls at school but was too nervous to approach them because she was a bit of a nerd. By chance, I had art class with one of the girls, and through that, I got introduced to the whole group. We started hanging out, and I actually enjoyed their company. But the moment Melanie saw that I had made friends with them first, she got jealous. She ran straight to our parents, complaining that I wasn't including her. I tried to explain that it wasn't as simple as just inviting her in, but my mother accused me of being selfish, and my dad told me it was my duty as a sister to look out for her. So, against my will, I introduced Melanie to the group. The problem was, she didn't exactly blend in well. She didn't have many friends, so when she finally got the chance to socialize, she went overboard, constantly trying to impress the girls, to the point where it felt intrusive. No matter how much she tried, the chemistry just wasn't there, and everyone could feel it. One of the girls in our group had a crush on a guy, and Melanie, thinking she was helping, went straight up to him and told him about it. Instead of handling it discreetly, the guy laughed and spread it around, embarrassing the girl. After that, the girls made it clear to me that they didn't want Melanie around anymore. I agreed, knowing it was the right decision, but Melanie didn't take it well. When she found out, she threw a massive tantrum and went crying to our parents, demanding that if the girls didn't want her around, then I shouldn't hang out with them either. She insisted that as her sister, I should stand by her. I refused. It wasn't my fault that things hadn't worked out for her, and I wasn't about to lose my friends over it. Of course, my parents sided with Melanie, lecturing me about how she had no bad intentions and that I should try to convince the girls to forgive her. And if they didn't, then I should cut them off, too. That was the moment I put my foot down. I wasn't going to let them dictate my friendships. I told them I had had enough. It wasn't my responsibility to find Melanie friends, and I wasn't going to sacrifice my own happiness just to make her feel better. My parents were furious. They gave me the silent treatment for weeks. But looking back, I'm glad I stood my ground. Those girls became more than just friends, they became like sisters to me. We laughed together, cried together, and shared some of the most meaningful moments of my life. At the time, though, it was hard to stick to my decision. There were moments of doubt, times when I wondered if I had done the wrong thing by putting myself first. But this wasn't the only reason Melanie resented me. There was another incident, one that made things even worse between us. Melanie had a crush on a guy, but I had no clue. He and I sat together in some classes and were just friends. One day, he asked me to junior prom, but I turned him down because I already had plans to go with someone else. That should have been the end of it. But when Melanie found out, she lost it. She went straight to our parents, sobbing about how I always took what she wanted and how I had been flirting with this guy for months just to spite her. She threw every insult she could think of at me, words no sister should ever say to another. Then, she told my parents that she wished I wasn't her sister at all. Instead of calming her down, my mother took her side, telling me that I had broken girl code and that, as her sister, I should have respected her feelings. I tried to explain that I hadn't even known she liked him and that I had rejected his invitation, so she was free to ask him out if she wanted. But Melanie wouldn't let it go. Deep down, I think she knew the guy wouldn't have been interested in her either, and she just wanted to take her frustration out on me. Not long after that, my dad randomly suggested we go out for ice cream, just the two of us. This was unusual since he never really made an effort to spend one-on-one time with me, so I was surprised but happy. That happiness didn't last long. As soon as we sat down, he started asking a bunch of strange questions, whether my boyfriend and I were being careful, if he came from a respectable family, and even if we had ever done drugs together. I was completely blindsided. I asked him what he was getting at, and that's when he dropped the bomb. Apparently, Melanie had been feeding them lies for months, telling them I was drinking, doing drugs, and getting into all kinds of trouble with my boyfriend. I was furious. I pulled out my phone right then and there, showing my dad proof that none of it was true. Later, when he confronted Melanie about it, she didn't even apologize. Instead, she doubled down, insisting that no one our age just hangs out with a guy, so obviously, I had to be hiding something. That was the last straw. I snapped. I yelled at her for stirring up unnecessary drama, for always making me the villain just because she was miserable with her own life. I told her it wasn't my fault that she had no one to date, and she needed to stay out of my business. That was the first and only time Melanie got physical with me. Without warning, she punched me. I wasn't expecting it at all. The impact sent me stumbling backward, and before I even registered what had happened, I felt a warm trickle running down my face. My nose was bleeding. I clutched it in pain, completely stunned. For all the terrible things she had done to me over the years, she had never crossed that line before. But in that moment, something between us shattered for good. My parents rushed me to the emergency room, all the while begging me not to file a police complaint against Melanie. They kept insisting that doing so would ruin her life, completely disregarding the fact that I was sitting in the back seat, clutching my bleeding nose in pain. Melanie, on the other hand, didn't show a hint of remorse, no apology, not even a glance in my direction. When we arrived at the hospital, a nurse asked me what had happened. I told her the truth. She immediately called Child Protective Services, CPS. That was the moment my parents lost it. They were furious with me, seeing my honesty as a betrayal, as if I had gone out of my way to sabotage the family. In their eyes, Melanie's attack was nothing more than an accident and isolated outburst that didn't warrant such drastic action. They pleaded with the authorities, assuring them that Melanie wasn't a threat to me and that this was completely out of character. In the end, Melanie wasn't taken in, but CPS warned my parents that they would be monitoring our situation closely in case anything like this happened again. That shook my parents to their core, and even Melanie seemed rattled by the whole thing. But instead of reflecting on her actions, she and my parents turned their anger toward me. Later that night, my parents sat me down, telling me how deeply disappointed they were. My mother cried, accusing me of tearing the family apart by bringing outsiders into our personal matters. My father's disappointment was quieter but just as cutting, his words laced with reproach as he questioned why I had chosen to escalate the situation instead of keeping it within the family. I stood my ground. I told them, in no uncertain terms, that I wanted Melanie out of my life. To my surprise, they agreed. I won't lie, part of me did feel guilty for getting CPS involved, but for the first time in my life, I felt safe in my own home. After the warning, my parents had a separate conversation with Melanie, and from that day forward, she completely stopped talking to me. Honestly, I preferred it that way. It was better than having her constantly trying to overshadow me or force herself into my life. When my grandparents heard about what had happened, they wasted no time. They told me to pack a bag and come live with them for the rest of high school. They informed my parents, who, surprisingly, didn't put up much of a fight. So, I left. Living with my grandparents was like stepping into an entirely different world. For the first time, I felt genuinely safe and loved. The remaining years of high school went by peacefully, and I made so many lasting memories with my friends. Not once during that time did my parents visit me or even call. It was as if I had ceased to exist to them. I knew they were happy enough with their golden child, so I never reached out either. Still, the way they discarded me so easily, like I was nothing, hurt more than I cared to admit. When graduation day arrived, my parents only showed up to cheer for Melanie. They didn't even acknowledge me, let alone congratulate me. It was as if I were a stranger to them. My grandparents, however, were there. And they were not having any of it. My grandfather called my parents out for their blatant favoritism, though I don't know exactly what he said to them. Whatever it was, it must have struck a nerve, because later, my father awkwardly walked up to me and muttered a half-hearted congratulations. It felt forced, but I took it for what it was. Shortly after, I received the news that I had been accepted into a great college with a full scholarship. I was over the moon. I had dreaded the idea of asking my parents for financial help, and now, I wouldn't have to. I excitedly told my grandparents, and they insisted on taking me out to celebrate. That night, after our celebratory dinner, my grandmother posted some pictures of me on Facebook, along with a heartfelt caption about how proud she was of me. It wasn't long before our extended family started chiming in, congratulating me. I guess some of them must have reached out to my parents, because the next day, my mother called. But it wasn't to congratulate me. Instead, she was livid. She told me that Melanie had locked herself in her room, crying, because she hadn't been accepted into any colleges yet. Apparently, my grandmother's post and the flood of congratulations from our relatives had made her feel like a failure. And, of course, my mother blamed me. She said I had deliberately flaunted my success to make Melanie feel bad. She even went as far as to accuse me of being responsible for Melanie's poor grades, claiming that ever since the CPS incident, Melanie had been depressed and unable to focus. That was the final straw. Hearing my own mother blame me for something so absurd shattered whatever small thread of hope I had left for a real relationship with her. That was the last time I spoke to her for a very long time. With my grandparents' help, I moved into my college dorm and prepared to start this new chapter of my life. Around the same time, my high school boyfriend and I broke up. His college was too far away, and we both knew a long-distance relationship wouldn't work. It was painful, but I was ready to move forward, open to whatever the future had in store. That's when I met Elliot. We were both freshmen, and we spent half our time in the library. Elliot was different from anyone I'd ever met. He was quiet, thoughtful, and just as studious as I was. We connected over our love of books and learning, and before I knew it, our friendship had deepened into something more. Being the kind of person I am, I didn't waste time beating around the bush. I told Elliot how I felt about him, and to my surprise, he admitted that he felt the same way. We started dating, and here we are 8 years later, still going strong. My grandparents adore Elliot, and I've met his family, too. His parents treat me like their own daughter, and on more than one occasion, his mother has told me how she always wished for a daughter, how happy she is that Elliot found someone like me. For the first time in my life, I'm surrounded by people who genuinely care about me. No resentment, no favoritism, just love. Over the years, I've shared stories of my childhood with Elliot. He listens with patience and understanding, never judging, always offering comfort when I need it. My parents, on the other hand, have barely been in my life. The only contact I've received from them has been the occasional birthday text when they remembered. Recently, though, things took a turn. Elliot proposed. It happened while we were on one of our usual sunrise treks, and it was absolutely perfect. He was so nervous, his hands shaking slightly as he asked the question, but I had no doubts. I said yes without hesitation. Overwhelmed with happiness, I posted pictures of our engagement on Instagram and immediately called my grandparents to share the news. They were thrilled, showering us with love and congratulations. But somehow, word spread. And, for the first time in years, my parents called me. At first, I thought it was just a simple congratulatory call, a polite gesture after years of silence. They asked about my life, my job, my apartment, things they had never cared to ask about before. And then, out of nowhere, my father hit me with a question I never expected. Can I walk you down the aisle? I was stunned. Just minutes ago, he hadn't even known which company I worked for, and now he wanted to play the role of a doting father? I told my father that I hadn't really thought about who would walk me down the aisle yet. Instead of respecting that, he immediately told me how embarrassing it would be if I didn't ask him, how people would gossip and question why my own father wasn't giving me away. He made it sound like letting him do it was the only logical choice. I scoffed. I told them outright that I wasn't even sure if they were going to be invited to the wedding at all, given that we had barely spoken in years. That response did not sit well with them. My mother jumped in, her voice laced with disappointment, going on about how family and tradition should always come first. She reminded me that no matter what had happened, they were still my parents, and I should be willing to let the past go. For a brief moment, I wavered. A part of me wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of repairing our relationship. But another part of me hesitated, wary of opening the door to disappointment and hurt all over again. Still, I was about to enter a new chapter in my life, and for some reason, I decided to give my dad this one thing. I told him he could walk me down the aisle. He seemed thrilled. With wedding plans in full swing, I reached out to my high school girlfriends, the ones who had stood by me for years, even as life pulled us in different directions. I told them I wanted our old gang back together and asked if they'd be my bridesmaids. There were happy tears, excited screams, and an instant, unanimous yes. We decided to celebrate by taking a trip to Vegas for my bachelorette party while Elliot had his own separate celebration with his friends. The trip was everything I hoped for: laughter, dancing, and a flood of unforgettable memories. We posted pictures, sharing snippets of the fun we had. But the moment I got back home, my parents called, and I could already hear the disappointment in their voices. They were upset that I hadn't invited Melanie. I didn't even hesitate before telling them there was no way I would have included her in my bachelorette party. In fact, I didn't want her to be involved in my life at all. That answer stunned them. They pressed me to explain, so I did. I told them that after everything Melanie had done, her deceit, her lies, the way she had tried to sabotage my life, there was no place for her in mine. I wasn't going to invite someone who had only ever hurt me to something as personal and joyous as my wedding celebrations. That's when my parents lost it. They insisted that I had no right to exclude her, that as her sister, it was my duty to include her in such an important milestone. They told me that Melanie had actually been looking forward to seeing me again once she heard I was getting married. That took me by surprise. I asked them why she would even think that, given that we hadn't spoken in years. Instead of answering, they brushed my concerns aside and repeated their usual script: "This isn't how sisters should treat each other." I sighed, trying to remain patient. "I understand where you're coming from," I told them, "but you need to understand that my relationship with Melanie is complicated. She has never apologized for what she did to me. Not once. And after everything, I don't feel comfortable having her at my wedding." As expected, my parents ignored my words completely. My mother insisted that she just wanted what was best for the family and that inviting Melanie wasn't even a big deal. My dad, on the other hand, was more concerned about what people would think, how the relatives would whisper about why my only sister wasn't at my wedding. But I was past the point of caring. I told them that I was fine with people talking about me. Let them gossip. Let them speculate. As long as I was surrounded by people I loved and trusted on my wedding day, that's all that mattered. That didn't sit well with them either. My mother tried another angle, asking if Elliot would be okay with me excluding my own sister. She even hinted that my in-laws might judge me for it, calling me cruel and heartless. I laughed. I told her that both Elliot and his family knew all about my family dynamics, and none of them cared if Melanie was at the wedding or not. They tried one last time to get me to reconsider, hammering in the importance of family, of forgiveness, of letting go of old wounds. But I stood my ground. In the end, we agreed to disagree. My parents told me they needed time to think things over, and we ended the call on that note. Despite feeling slightly guilty for standing up to them, I confided in my grandparents, and as always, they had my back. They reassured me that I wasn't wrong to set boundaries and that my parents were simply trying to guilt-trip me as they always had. After that, I felt much better and threw myself back into wedding planning, letting the excitement drown out any lingering doubts. Then, last week, my dad called again. He told me that after thinking long and hard, he and my mom had decided they wouldn't be attending the wedding after all. Before I could even process that, he continued. Since I had chosen to exclude Melanie from the wedding, she had decided to throw a housewarming party on the same day. My parents had helped her find a new place, and instead of attending my wedding, they would be going to her event instead. For a moment, I was speechless. I felt a wave of disbelief wash over me as I processed what he was saying. My own sister's house party had taken priority over my wedding. It shouldn't have shocked me. I should have expected something like this from them. And yet, the realization hit hard, a bitter pill I wasn't prepared to swallow. I took a breath, keeping my voice steady. "I understand," I said simply before hanging up the call. I wanted to act like it didn't bother me, like I wasn't affected. But deep down, the sting of rejection cut deeper than I could ever put into words. When I told Elliot what had happened, he was furious. He couldn't believe how insensitive my parents were, especially after they were the ones who had insisted on being included in the first place. It was Elliot who gave me the idea that changed everything. "Why don't you ask your grandfather to walk you down the aisle?" he said. "He and your grandmother have been there for you way more than your parents ever have." And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. Because he was right. I agreed with Elliot's suggestion and called my grandparents to ask if they would walk me down the aisle. As I spoke, tears welled up in my eyes, overwhelmed by just how much they meant to me. "You and Grandpa have always been there for me," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "You've been more than just grandparents, you've been like parents to me. I can't imagine anyone else I'd rather have by my side on my wedding day." There wasn't even a moment of hesitation. They said yes immediately, telling me how honored they would be to walk me down the aisle. Unlike my parents, they reassured me that they would never let me down. In that moment, a sense of peace washed over me. I had a family who truly loved and accepted me, flaws and all. I also spoke to my in-laws about the situation, and Elliot's parents were nothing but supportive. They assured me that they didn't care whether my parents attended or not, they were simply excited to celebrate our union and welcome me into their family. Then, just 2 days before the wedding, I woke up to several missed calls from my father. Assuming it was an emergency, I called him back. The moment he picked up, he asked if it was true that my grandparents were walking me down the aisle. Yes, I told him, unsure of where this was going. That's when he lost it. He went off about how disrespectful it was for me to ask my grandparents instead of him. I reminded him that he had been the one to decline attending my wedding, so I didn't understand why it mattered to him. But he wasn't done. He yelled, saying that he and my mother had only refused to come because they wanted to teach me a lesson, that they thought declining the invitation would make me realize the error of my ways. He ranted about how he and mom were the ones who had raised me, paid for my food, my education, and that my grandparents had no right to take his place. I tried to reason with him, explaining that my grandparents had been there for me in ways he and mom never had. But he refused to listen. Then he threw in one final jab. "You've done nothing but alienate everyone around you," he said. "This is all your fault." After that call, I couldn't help but wonder, had I really done something wrong? Was I truly in the wrong for asking my grandparents to walk me down the aisle? Update 1. Wow, I never expected so many people would respond to my story. I've read through a lot of advice and suggestions, and one thing has become very clear: I need to permanently cut off my parents. Their constant back and forth, their emotional manipulation, it's exhausting. And it's starting to take a toll on my mental health. I don't want them in my life anymore, not when they've made it so clear that Melanie will always come first. I've known for a long time that my parents are selfish, but even so, how does a child just stop loving their parents? It's easy to say, but actually doing it is something else entirely. Still, for the sake of my own peace of mind, I have no choice. Tomorrow is my wedding, and I refuse to let them ruin this for me. Update 2. Sorry for the lack of updates this past month, but I've been busy because my wedding happened. And it was perfect. Walking down the aisle with my grandparents by my side, I felt nothing but joy. Even though my parents weren't there, I didn't let their absence overshadow my happiness. As I exchanged vows with Elliot, promising to spend the rest of my life with him, I knew I had made the right decision. The reception was an absolute blast. My girlfriends and I danced the night away, and as I looked around the room, I realized something important: sometimes, your chosen family is the one that truly matters. That being said, I won't lie. There was a small pang of sadness when I saw Elliot's parents and cousins giving heartfelt speeches, celebrating him with so much love and pride. I knew I would never experience that kind of support from my own parents. But I reminded myself that I had surrounded myself with people who genuinely loved and cared for me. My girlfriends gave beautiful speeches, sharing stories of our childhood and the bond that had carried us through the years. In that moment, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. After the wedding, Elliot and I left for our honeymoon, a generous gift from his parents. We spent days just relaxing, enjoying the time together, and every time I looked at Elliot, I felt this giddy excitement, this wonderful realization that he was my husband now. As for my parents, I blocked them everywhere. I didn't bother sending an explanation, because, frankly, they don't deserve one. I have no idea whether Melanie actually had a housewarming party on the same day or if it was just an excuse for my parents to avoid my wedding. At this point, I don't even care. I wish them all the best with their beloved daughter. Update 3. I wasn't planning to update again, but something unexpected happened. I hadn't checked my email in over a month. Wedding planning and the honeymoon had kept me busy. But today, as I was sorting through everything, I found an email from Melanie. I hesitated for a long time, debating whether to open it or just delete it. But curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a long message from Melanie. She wrote about how she regretted how strained our relationship had become and how she wished we could reconcile. She admitted that she had been selfish and immature, acknowledging the pain she had caused me over the years. She apologized sincerely, from what I could tell, and said that she was happy for me, that she truly wished me the best in my new life. But then, toward the end, she asked me not to punish our parents by cutting them off, saying that they missed me. Reading her words, I felt a swirl of emotions: surprise, skepticism, even a small flicker of hope. Part of me wants to believe that Melanie has changed, that she really does regret everything and wants to fix things. But another part of me remains guarded. This all seems too sudden, too convenient. And as for my parents? No. I know for a fact they don't miss me. If they did, they wouldn't have treated me the way they did for years. I considered responding to Melanie's email but decided against it. Forgiveness isn't something that can be rushed. It's a process, one that requires time, healing, and reflection. I don't know if I'll ever be ready to forgive Melanie, but for now, I'm not burning the bridge completely. She's the only one who has actually apologized. But one thing I do know for sure: after my wedding, I no longer feel alone. I have a loving husband, amazing friends, and the unwavering support of my grandparents. With them by my side, I know I can face whatever comes next without needing Melanie or my parents. To help me process everything, I've also taken another step. I've booked my first therapy appointment. It's time to finally heal.